Hey everybody, Mr. Bone again with the sixth grade essential questions. This time we are up to question number 5. Does perspective influence history? So as usual, what do I need to know in order to be able to answer the question? First of all, I probably should know what perspective means. It means your point of view. Who's telling the story? Uh, do we see a battle in history from both sides, just one side? It makes a big difference on who's telling that story. The question is, does it matter? Yes, very much. For instance, the story of Little Red Riding Hood might look completely different if the wolf were telling the story instead of Little Red Riding Hood. Perhaps he had reasons that he needed to eat up Grandma and look for that basket of goodies. Which perspective do we usually see? Well, sorry to say, a lot of times the phrase history is written by the winners comes true. For instance, a lot of times if you do have a battle, the winners are the ones who write the story. The losers may be too dead to do the writing. So a lot of times it is written by the people who end up doing the conquering, the winning, end up being in charge. And of course, their point of view is going to look a lot different than the people who are being killed or lose the battle or are now the slaves. History usually that we see is the history that doesn't make us feel bad. So many times in our American history, we may concentrate more on the American spirit and how settlers moved west and overcame all the obstacles of the wilderness and all that, rather than the idea that we essentially wiped out millions of Native Americans, stole land, went back on treaties, did some pretty despicable things on purpose. We usually don't talk about that part because it makes us feel bad. It's a history that we have time to cover in classes and textbooks. For instance, later on in a couple of years in 8th grade, I'm sure Mrs. Pedley will be covering Andrew Jackson to some extent. But if you were perhaps in a college course, you could have an entire year just on the couple of years that Andrew Jackson was actually president. So depending on what your class allows for time, and I'm sorry to say, in our classes, we generally don't have a ton of time to cover things very deeply. We're covering half the world at a time, and there's not a lot of time to get very deep into a lot of the subjects. And you have to cover, we don't have to, but many times we cover what's in the textbook. And the textbook companies put in their textbooks, a lot of times, what politicians want them to put in. Why should we look at other perspectives? Why does it matter whose perspective we look at? Well, if you're telling the human story, it's rather incomplete unless you hear everyone's side. Think about the last time there was 2 students that maybe were having an argument or a fight. And if only one person got to tell their side of the story, it wouldn't be a very effective story, would it? It would be pretty one-sided. If we're more interested in the why history happens rather than memorizing what happened, we definitely need to know the whole story. Otherwise, we won't have a complete story of why. So I hope that all these things help you again with answering the question of, does perspective influence history? These questions will stay posted on Classroom. And again, if you need to come back to them at the semester, or if some of you are using them to study for your tests and quizzes, then that's a great tool as well. And don't forget, as we say here in Hemlock, have a husky day.